The night Pearl Brooks walked into the Caldwell County Social, every man in that lamplit barn turned to look at her. But not a single one of them saw her the way Isaiah Reed did when he glanced up from the corner and felt something shift inside his chest like a door he had never known was closed suddenly swinging wide open. It was the autumn of 1878, deep in the Kansas Territory, where the town of Millhaven sat stubborn and sun-baked against the flat prairie like a man refusing to be blown over by the wind. Millhaven was the kind of town that had survived grasshoppers and drought and cattle raiders, and still managed to hold its Saturday socials in the old Henson barn with paper lanterns and a fiddle player named Coop, who only knew 4 songs, but played them with enough heart to make a person forgive the repetition. The war had been over for more than a decade by then, but its shadow stretched long across the plains, and the people of Millhaven carried their own particular brands of weariness and hope, often at the same time. Pearl Brooks had come to Millhaven 3 months prior, arriving on the stage from Dodge City with 1 trunk, a sewing kit, and a letter of introduction to a woman named Mabel Finch who ran the dry goods store and also, unofficially, acted as the town's clearinghouse for respectable women in need of employment. Pearl was 24 years old, with dark eyes the color of creek water at dusk, and a way of holding herself that suggested she had once expected more from the world and had quietly renegotiated the terms without bitterness. She had been a schoolteacher back in Missouri, but that life had closed when the man she was supposed to marry turned out to be a liar and a coward in the specific way that some men are liars and cowards, taking everything tender a woman offers and using it against her like a weapon. She had packed her trunk, taken what little money she had, and pointed herself west, because west was where people went when they needed the world to be bigger than the one they were leaving behind. Mabel Finch had been kind to her. She had given Pearl a room above the store and a job keeping the accounts and occasionally watching the counter when Mabel's arthritis flared up. The work was quiet and steady and Pearl was grateful for it, even on the days when the dust came through the gaps in the window frames and settled on everything, and she had to remind herself that she had chosen this, that this was freedom, that freedom sometimes looked different than you expected. The Henson Barn social was Mabel's idea. She had told Pearl 3 times in the preceding week that it was high time Pearl got out and met some of the townspeople properly, and Pearl had agreed each time with the kind of polite noncommittal smile that is really a form of postponement. But Mabel had a way of transforming suggestions into facts simply through repetition and optimism, and so, on the evening of the 7th of September, 1878, Pearl found herself standing in the doorway of the Henson barn in her best blue dress, which was a dress that had seen better days but still had its dignity, listening to Coop saw away at a reel and watching the townspeople of Millhaven spin each other around the swept dirt floor. She recognized a few faces. Tom Garrett from the feed store, who was a decent man but talked exclusively about grain prices. The Pickworth sisters, who were both named variations of Margaret and were therefore called Maggie and Margaret to prevent confusion. Reverend Hollies, who was there as a chaperone and wore the expression of a man who considered dancing a moderate sin but lacked the authority to say so outright. And standing near the punch table, clearly uncomfortable in a freshly pressed shirt that still had the fold lines from the store shelf, was a man Pearl did not recognize. He was tall, the kind of tall that seems less about height and more about the particular way a person occupies space, as if they are taking their time deciding how much of the room they actually need. He had brown skin weathered by long days in the sun, broad hands that he did not seem to know what to do with now that they were not occupied with work, and a jaw that carried the set of a man who had learned patience not from temperament but from necessity. He looked to be somewhere around 28 or 29, though the plains had a way of aging a person so that precise years became harder to read. He was watching the dancing the way a person watches something that belongs to other people, with appreciation and a careful distance. Pearl noticed that he was the only man at the social who was not already paired off or in conversation, and that this seemed not to trouble him. He had the self-possession of a person who had long since made peace with being alone in a crowd. She made her way to the punch table because it was the nearest destination with a purpose, and because she, too, felt the particular aloneness of the newcomer, and there was something in that shared condition that made the stranger less daunting than the couple spinning past her. He noticed her when she was 3 steps away, and he turned slightly and gave her the kind of nod that is not perfunctory but not intrusive, the nod of a man who sees you but is not going to make a demand of it. "Evening," he said. His voice was low and even, and it carried the faint trace of somewhere else, a cadence that was not quite Kansas and not quite Missouri either, something that had traveled. "Evening," Pearl said, and reached for the ladle. "You look about as delighted to be here as I feel." He looked at her for a moment with something that was almost a smile, as if the honesty of it had caught him off guard. "That obvious?" "Mabel Finch?" Pearl asked. "Tom Garrett," he said. "Ah, he told you it would be a good opportunity." "He told me 3 times, Pearl laughed. It was a real laugh, not the polished social variety, and it came out a little louder than she intended, and she pressed her lips together after, but the damage was done and the man's almost smile became an actual one, and he extended his hand. "Isaiah Reed," he said. "I work the Delacroix spread out past the Eastern Ridge." Pearl shook his hand. "Pearl Brooks, I keep accounts for Mabel Finch. She's a good woman. She is persistent but good." They stood together at the punch table and talked about Millhaven with the particular ease of people who are both new enough to the place that they have no history to defend and no alliances to maintain. Isaiah had been working the Delacroix cattle operation for 2 years, having come up from Texas, where he had worked the long drives before the rail lines cut the trails shorter and shorter, and the big drives became something older men talked about with nostalgia. He was a foreman now, which was an unusual position for a black man in this part of Kansas in 1878, and Pearl understood without him saying it directly that this position had not come easily, and that it was held by force of competence and a particular quiet authority that made it difficult for even the most resistant men to argue against. The Delacroix family had come down from Illinois after the war and did not carry the particular prejudices of some of their neighbors, which helped, but Isaiah's standing was his own earning, and he knew it. Pearl told him about Missouri and the schoolroom and the stage to Dodge City, leaving out the man who had been a liar and a coward, because that part of the story was hers to keep for now. Isaiah listened the way some people never learn to listen, without waiting for his turn to speak, actually attending to what she was saying, and Pearl found herself saying more than she usually did with a person she had just met. Coop launched into his second go-round of the only waltz in his repertoire, and a few couples took to the floor with more tenderness than the reel had allowed. The barn grew warmer and the lantern light turned everything gold and amber and the kind of beautiful that only happens in temporary places. "I should warn you," Isaiah said, "that I cannot dance." "Cannot or will not?" Pearl asked. "Both, honestly, but cannot feels kinder to whoever's feet might be involved." "That is a very thoughtful position to take." "I try." He paused and then said something that changed the whole evening. "I don't suppose you'd like to step outside for a few minutes. The stars are something to see tonight, and it's getting warm in here." Pearl looked at him. There was nothing in his expression that was angling for something, no calculation or performance. He simply meant what he said, that the stars were something to see and the barn was warm, and he was asking her to come look at something beautiful with him. It was such a straightforward and unguarded invitation that Pearl almost did not know how to receive it, because her experience of men asking her to step outside had rarely been as simple as they made it sound. But Isaiah Reed was looking at her with those patient, clear eyes, and Pearl said yes. They stepped out through the barn's side door, and the night air came at them cool and immediate after the warmth inside, carrying the smell of dry grass and horses, and the particular clean emptiness that the Kansas prairie had at night when the wind went quiet. And the stars. The stars above Millhaven in September of 1878 were the kind of stars that cities had already begun to make impossible, a canopy so dense with light that the Milky Way cut across the sky like a river of crushed glass. Pearl stopped walking 2 steps from the door and looked up and felt something come loose in her chest, some tight-held thing she had been carrying since Missouri. "Oh," she said softly. "Yes," Isaiah said. They stood in the darkness and looked up, and for a while neither of them said anything because nothing needed to be said. The fiddle music came muffled through the barn wall, Coop going back to the reel, and inside people were laughing and spinning, and out here there were just the two of them and about 10,000 years of starlight. "Do you know them?" Pearl asked. "The stars, the names." "Some," Isaiah said. "My grandmother taught me some. She grew up in South Carolina, and she said people used the stars to navigate. The drinking gourd." He pointed north where the Big Dipper hung low and clear. "Follow the 2 end stars and you find the North Star. That one doesn't move." Pearl followed the direction of his hand. "She taught you for the reason people taught that." It was not a question, but he answered it. "Yes," he said simply. Pearl thought about what that meant, to have a grandmother who taught you to find north, because there had been a time when finding north meant the difference between freedom and captivity. She thought about the particular weight of that knowledge passing down through hands, and she felt a great deal of respect for the woman she would never meet. "My mother taught me to find Orion," Pearl said. "She said it was the hunter. She liked that. She said it was good to know the hunter's position in the sky." Practical woman. Extremely. They found Orion together, Pearl pointing and Isaiah confirming, and then they found Cassiopeia and the Pleiades and discussed whether the Pleiades looked more like a dipper or a small cluster of confused travelers, which turned into a genuine debate that neither of them won or needed to. The social inside continued without them. Pearl did not notice, at first, how long they had been standing in the prairie night. She was too absorbed in the conversation, which had moved from stars to the way the cattle behaved in the weeks before a weather change, to whether Millhaven had the character to survive another dry season, to what Pearl thought she might do with herself in a year or 5 years if she was being honest rather than polite about it. Isaiah asked questions like a man who was genuinely curious rather than a man who was performing curiosity in order to be asked questions in return, and Pearl found herself thinking things out loud that she had only ever thought privately. "I think I want to teach again," she said, surprising herself a little with the directness of it. "There's no school here yet." "But there ought to be." "There ought to be," Isaiah agreed. "There are at least 14 children in this county that I know of who are being educated by whoever has time and patience, which is not the same as being educated proper. You've been counting." "I notice things." Pearl looked at him in the darkness. The light from inside the barn came through the gaps in the boards in thin gold lines, and one of them fell across his face, illuminating the patient set of his jaw and the quiet consideration in his eyes. She thought that she had not been looked at the way this man looked at things, with careful attention and no expectation, in a long time, and possibly never by someone she had just met. "Isaiah Reed," she said. "Pearl Brooks," he said. They stood there in the September night, and between them something had begun that neither of them named yet, because the naming of a thing changes it, and sometimes it is better to let a thing breathe before you give it its shape. When Pearl finally went back inside to collect her shawl and thank Mabel for dragging her out, it was past 10 o'clock, and most of the couples were winding down, and the Pickworth sisters were helping stack chairs. Mabel gave Pearl a look that was 3 parts satisfaction and 1 part restraint, because Mabel Finch was too wise to make a woman self-conscious about her own happiness. But Pearl Brooks never quite came back in, not fully. Some part of her had stayed outside under those stars with the tall, quiet man who had simply asked her to come look at something beautiful, and from that night forward, Millhaven was a different kind of place. The following week came in bright and businesslike. the way Kansas September weeks do, with big sky and dust, and the constant industriousness of a town preparing for the coming cold. Pearl worked through Mabel's accounts on Monday and Tuesday and spent Wednesday reorganizing the storeroom shelves, and the whole time she was aware of a low and steady hum inside herself that she recognized eventually as anticipation. She did not expect Isaiah to come to town on Thursday. He had no particular reason to. The Delacroix spread was 15 miles out, and a foreman's work was not the kind that left much time for social calls. But she found herself, when the bell above the shop door rang, looking up with a certain quality of attention. It was not Isaiah on Thursday. It was Tom Garrett wanting twine. On Friday, however, when Pearl was sweeping the front step in the cool morning air, a horse and rider came down the main street at an easy pace and drew up at the post outside Mabel's store. And when she looked up, it was Isaiah Reed with a look on his face that was working hard to be casual about something. He had a crate in his saddlebag. He said he had been coming to town for supplies anyway, and had thought, since he was coming to town for supplies anyway, that he might stop by and return the book he had borrowed from Tom Garrett, and also that Mabel Finch had ordered a particular grade of salt that the ranch used and he was there to collect it. Pearl accepted all of these explanations at face value with a straight face and helped him find Mabel's salt order. Mabel herself appeared from the back room with the specific benign brightness of a woman who has decided not to notice anything conspicuous, and offered them both coffee from the pot she kept on the small stove near the window. They drank coffee in the thin autumn sunlight that came through Mabel's front window and talked about the state of the roads after the last rain, and whether the Methodist Church's new reverend was going to be an improvement on the previous one, and the small urgent news of a town that is large enough to have news but small enough that everyone knows whose news it is. It was completely ordinary, and Pearl found it one of the nicest mornings she had spent since coming to Kansas. When Isaiah left, he said he would be in town again the following Friday for supplies, and Pearl said that was good to know in a tone of voice that meant more than it said, and he heard it. She could tell, because of the quality of the pause before he tipped his hat and turned his horse east. The Fridays became a pattern, and the pattern became the thing they both looked forward to most in their weeks without quite discussing that this was so. He would come in with some legitimate errand. They would end up in conversation at Mabel's window with coffee, and sometimes, when his errands allowed the time, they would walk the short length of Millhaven's main street together, looking in the windows of the buildings and talking about whatever the week had brought them. Pearl told him about the meeting she had attended at the church hall where she had raised, slightly nervously, the question of establishing a proper schoolroom in Millhaven. She had expected resistance, and she had gotten some, but she had also gotten more support than she expected, particularly from the women of the town who had been keeping their children educated by patchwork and were tired of the uncertainty of it. The mayor, a man named Holbrook who was mostly reasonable, had said he would look into the matter of funding. Isaiah listened to this with great attention. Who pushed back? He asked. Reverend Holly's mostly. He thinks the church should be the center of education. He's wrong. I know. I told him so politely. Isaiah smiled, and Pearl had come to love that smile by now, the way it arrived slowly as if giving itself permission. I bet you did, he said. I also told Mayor Holbrook that if funding was an issue, I would teach for half the going rate until the school had enough enrollment to justify the full amount. Isaiah stopped walking. Pearl, I know what I'm doing. That's not the point. You shouldn't have to, Isaiah. She said his name quietly and he stopped. I know what I'm doing. I have a room and an income from Mabel that covers my needs. I want this school more than I want full wages right now. That's my choice to make. He looked at her for a long moment and then nodded, the nod of a man who respects a decision even while wishing the world were arranged differently. All right, he said. What do you need? Pearl blinked. What? For the school, what do you need? There are men on the Delacroix spread who have carpentry skills and slow times between drives. I could ask. Pearl stood in the middle of Millhaven's dusty Main Street in October of 1878 and felt something so warm and so sudden that she had to look away at the hardware store window for a moment to collect herself. "I don't have a building yet," she said. "Start with what you need for when you do." She started a list that afternoon. October moved through Millhaven in long golden days and cold, sharp nights, and the nights made Pearl think of the Henson barn and the stars, and she found herself stepping outside in the evening sometimes, just for a few minutes, to look up at the sky with a feeling that was partly gratitude and partly the pleasant ache of wanting something that was not yet fully hers. The complication came in November. His name was Clarence Pell, and he arrived in Millhaven on a Tuesday with 2 associates, and a lot of noise, and a manner that Pearl recognized immediately as belonging to a man who was accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. He was a land agent, or claimed to be, and he had a letter from a railroad company whose interest in the Millhaven region had to do with a proposed line extension that would require the purchase, or in some cases the compelled relinquishment, of significant parcels of land in the eastern part of the county. The eastern part of the county included the Delacroix spread. Pearl heard about this from Mabel, who heard it from the postmaster, who had seen the letter when Pell asked him to direct him to Mayor Holbrook's office. By the time Isaiah came to town that Friday, the letter was all anyone was talking about. Pearl watched his face when she told him. It did not change expression very much, which she had come to understand was not the same as the information not mattering. Isaiah received difficult news by going very still, and the stillness had a quality to it that was actually a kind of heightened alertness, the stillness of a man who is thinking hard and fast behind a calm exterior. "How much of the eastern ridge does the railroad want?" he asked. "I don't know exactly. Pell held a meeting with Holbrook yesterday, but it wasn't open." The Delacroix family owns 600 acres on the eastern ridge. The ranch's best grazing land is on the south quarter of that. If the railroad takes the south quarter for right-of-way, the operation as it stands is not viable. Pearl had not done the full accounting of this herself, but hearing him lay it out flat and factual made it real in a new way. Would they have to sell? That depends on whether the railroad has the power to compel sale, and that depends on the territory legislation and what deals Pell has already made at the territorial capital level. He paused. The Delacroix family has been fair employers. I would not like to see them lose what they've built. Pearl noticed that he said the Delacroix family had been fair employers, not that they were his employers, and she understood that Isaiah's concern for the ranch was real but not sentimental, that he was a man who had built his own professional standing through his own labor and could build it elsewhere if he had to, and that the most pressing concern was not his job but his employer's livelihood and the situation of the men who worked the ranch. "I know a lawyer in Dodge City," Pearl said. "He handled some matters for my father before my father passed. He's honest. I could write to him." Isaiah looked at her. "That's not your fight, Pearl." "I know that," she said. "I'm choosing to make it mine." Another long look. Another slow nod. Pearl was beginning to understand that Isaiah's nods were a whole language in themselves, that this particular nod meant something like, "I see you and I am grateful, and I don't want to need this help, but I am glad you are the kind of person who offers it." She wrote to Edward Carey in Dodge City that evening, laying out the situation as she understood it, and asking whether the railroad's power of compelled purchase extended to territory lands held by private parties under the homestead arrangements. Carey's reply came back inside 2 weeks, and it was not entirely encouraging, but it was not hopeless either. The railroad's power was real but contingent on specific territorial authorization that had not yet been fully secured, and there was a window of time and a procedural avenue through which the Delacroix family, if they acted quickly and correctly, might be able to negotiate rather than simply be dictated to. Pearl brought the letter to Isaiah on the next Friday, and they sat together at Mabel's window in the November cold with the coffee going warm between them and read it through twice. Isaiah read it with the focused attention of a man who understands the stakes of documents. And Pearl, watching him, thought about all the ways the world had made it necessary for a man like him to understand those stakes, to know that written things carried power, and that ignorance of written things had been used as a weapon against people who looked like him for generations. She felt the anger of that on his behalf without making it into something performative, just held it quietly as information about the shape of the world. "I need to take this to Mr. Delacroix today," Isaiah said. "Take it. It's yours." He looked at her across the table, and for a moment the careful propriety of their Friday mornings fell away and something more direct was in his expression, something warm and certain and a little overwhelming in its clarity. "Pearl," he said, and then stopped. "Isaiah," she said, "I would like to—" He stopped again, and the hesitation was unusual for him, because he was generally a man who said what he meant. "When this Pell business is settled, I would like to take you somewhere that isn't a storeroom with coffee, if you'd be willing." Pearl looked at this man who had asked her to look at stars, and listened to her talk about teaching and offered his carpenters to her school, and who was right now holding a letter she had written on his behalf with his large, careful hands, and she thought that she had not known what quiet courage looked like in a person until she knew Isaiah Reed. "I'd be willing," she said. He left for the Delacroix spread with the letter, and Pearl stood in Mabel's doorway and watched the horse and rider grow smaller against the flat brown distance of the Kansas plain, and Mabel came and stood beside her and said absolutely nothing, which was the most gracious thing she could have done. The Pell business was not quick, but it was not endless either. Mr. Delacroix, who was a pragmatic man with a lawyer's instinct for knowing when he was being backed into a corner, took the Carey letter to Wichita and spent 3 days in meetings at the Territorial Land Office with a hired attorney from Topeka. Pell's attempts to move quickly hit the procedural resistance that Carey had identified, and while the railroad eventually did get its right-of-way through the eastern county, it was a narrower corridor than originally planned, and it skirted the southern grazing land rather than cutting through it. The Delacroix spread survived intact. Isaiah told Pearl about it on a cold Friday in December, when the wind came off the prairie with a specific ferocity that is particular to the Kansas winter, and the few people on Millhaven's Main Street were moving quickly and leaning into it. He told her in the doorway of Mabel's store, and his face carried the kind of relief that is not demonstrative because the tension it is releasing was never demonstrative either, just a deep easing like a rope that has been pulled tight finally being allowed to go slack. "Good," Pearl said. "The letter made the difference. Carey's letter, your letter. Edward Carey's letter that I merely facilitated." "Pearl," she relented. "Good," she said again, but warmer this time. They were standing very close together in the doorway because of the wind, and the closeness was not accidental on either side, though neither acknowledged it as such. The wind cut around the door frame and Pearl's shawl lifted at the edge and she caught it, and Isaiah's hand was there at the same moment, not grabbing but just there, steadying the edge of the fabric, his fingers brushing the back of her hand for half a second before both of them adjusted, and the moment resolved itself into something that was not a moment but had the gravity of one. "I believe I owe you a proper outing," Isaiah said, looking forward into the street rather than at her. "You do," Pearl agreed, looking the same direction. "Sunday the weather may break." Sunday would be fine. On Sunday the weather broke, as he had predicted, and the day came up pale and clear and cold in the specific way of a prairie winter day that is not trying to be anything other than itself. Isaiah arrived at Mabel's at 10 in the morning with a horse and a buggy that he had clearly borrowed from the Delacroix stable, because it was cleaner and better appointed than anything a working foreman would own, and Pearl appeared in her blue dress with a coat over it, and her hair done differently than it usually was, pinned up more carefully, with 2 small braids at the temples in the way her mother had taught her. And Isaiah looked at her standing on the step, and something crossed his face that he did not try to hide. "You look fine," he said, and the word fine in his mouth meant something more than the word usually means. It carried a weight of sincerity that Pearl felt in her sternum. "So do you," she said, and she meant it. He had dressed with the same careful effort as the barn social months ago, but more comfortably now, as if he had made peace with being presentable. They drove out along the ridge road that curved north of town, and eventually came around to a high flat place where the land opened up, and you could see for what seemed like forever in every direction. The brown and gold of the winter plain running out to the horizon in a way that stopped conversation and replaced it with something larger. Isaiah had brought a basket that contained bread and dried venison and 2 small jars of apple preserves that he admitted, when pressed, had been made by the Delacroix housekeeper, Mrs. Fontaine, who had taken an interest in the excursion and packed it herself. "She packed your courting basket," Pearl said, with a carefully maintained neutrality. "She offered. I didn't want to be rude." "Of course." Pearl spread the preserves on the bread with the small knife from the basket and handed him a piece, and they ate on the ridge with the winter wind mild for the moment and the sky pressing down blue and enormous above them. And Pearl thought that she had eaten better meals in better places, and none of them had tasted like this. "Tell me about Texas," she said. "You've told me about the drives and the rail lines, but not about Texas." He thought about this with the serious attention he gave to direct questions. "I grew up outside of Galveston. My father worked the docks. My mother taught at the freedmen's school after the war." He paused. "She was a teacher too. I always thought about that." Pearl looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Nothing exactly, just that I noticed it. When you told me what you did," he looked out at the plain. "She passed in 1872, fever. I'm sorry. My father's still in Galveston. He writes when he can. We're on good terms." Pearl thought about the Galveston docks and the freedmen's school, and the particular kind of building and rebuilding that people had to do after the war in the places where the war had unmade the most, and she thought about what it had cost and what it had built, and she felt a great tenderness for the family she would never know. "My mother is still in Missouri," Pearl said. "My father died 4 years ago, consumption. She's living with my brother now. She writes me every month and worries about the climate here." "Is she right to worry?" "About the climate, possibly. About me, no." He smiled, the slow permission smile. "No," he agreed. "I don't think she is." They sat on the ridge in the winter sunshine for 2 hours, longer than either of them had intended, talking about their families and their pasts, and the particular weight of being people who had left one life behind and were in the middle of building another. It was the kind of conversation that requires trust to begin and generates more trust as it goes. And by the time Isaiah helped Pearl back into the buggy for the drive home, they were in a different place than they had been at the start of the morning, both of them knowing it and neither of them needing to state it. On the drive back, Pearl's hand was on the seat between them and Isaiah's hand was also on the seat between them, and at some point in the last mile before town, their hands were touching, not held, just resting against each other with a warmth that was entirely intentional and entirely unspoken. And Pearl watched the road and felt that warmth moving up her arm and into her chest, and settling there like something that had been looking for a place to live. December turned toward the new year of 1879, and with it came the cold that was not a suggestion but a statement. The kind of January Kansas cold that is physical and absolute and makes everything that happens inside, near a fire, feel like the only real thing. Millhaven drew inward in the cold months, the main street quieter, the Saturday socials suspended until spring, the town's business conducted briskly and with less lingering conversation. Isaiah came to town less in January, the demands of the winter ranch work cutting into the time he had been finding for Friday visits, but he sent notes, which Pearl had not expected. They arrived with the weekly mail, short notes in a hand that was careful and clear, and showed the evidence of a man who had been taught to write by someone who valued it, and they said things like, "The north quarter fence came down in last week's wind, but we have it repaired." Mrs. Fontaine has made the opinion that you ought to have a jar of her preserved pears, and I am enclosing one, on her authority, not mine. The stars were clear Thursday night, and I thought of you. Pearl kept these notes in the cigar box she used for her most important papers. She wrote back. Her letters were longer than his notes, because Pearl thought in paragraphs, and she filled them with what was happening with the school project, which was progressing, Mayor Holbrook having approved a modest town fund for the construction of a proper schoolroom to be built in the spring, and with her observations about Millhaven's winter character, and a description of the book she was reading and small, careful questions about what he thought about things. She did not write about what she felt, not directly, because it was still new enough to need protecting, but she wrote around it in a way that was perfectly clear to both of them. The school was the great project of Pearl's winter. She had been approved as its teacher at a salary that was still somewhat under the going rate, as she had offered, but Mayor Holbrook had agreed in writing that it would be reviewed upward once enrollment was established. She had a building promised for spring construction, a one-room structure to be raised on the east side of town on land that had been set aside for civic purposes. She had a list of students who would enroll, 14 children aged 6 to 13, and she had a growing collection of donated materials, slates and chalk, and a set of McGuffey readers that a family from Ohio had brought with them and deemed surplus. She had also, through conversations at the church hall and the dry goods store, and the quiet, patient work of one woman with a clear vision, and an ability to make people feel that their investment in the future was a reasonable thing, assembled a genuine sense of civic will around the schoolhouse. This was not nothing. In a town like Millhaven, civic will was a fragile and precious thing, easily redirected by drought or cattle prices, or the various human resistances that crop up whenever anyone proposes something new, and Pearl had cultivated it with the same care a gardener gives to plants in uncertain soil. She told Isaiah about all of this in her letters, and in the February morning, when the weather let up briefly, and he came to town for supplies, and they walked the east lot where the building would go, standing in the hard frozen ground with their breath making visible clouds in the cold air. Pearl pointed out where she wanted the windows, facing east and west for maximum light, and where the door should be, and where she envisioned a small yard for the children's breaks, and Isaiah stood beside her listening and looking, and then began asking questions that were the questions of a man who was mentally converting vision into construction, practical questions about lumber grades and roofing material and the floor situation. "You've done building work?" Pearl asked. "Some. On the drives we built our own structures when we had to, and I've helped on the ranch. Would you be willing to consult with whoever Holbrook assigns to build it?" He looked at the lot, calculating. "I'll do better than consult," he said. "Give me the dimensions you want and I'll put together a materials list that will cost less than whatever Holbrook's man quoted." Pearl looked at him. "Isaiah, you have a ranch to run. The worst of the winter work is behind us. The next 6 weeks are the slowest of the year before the spring drives start. I have the time." She wanted to argue with him about it and could not find an actual argument. "You're very useful," she said instead. "I try to be." Pearl turned to look at the lot and not at him, because the expression on her face was one she was not quite ready to show him yet, the full of it, the depth of what she was feeling standing in this frozen field with this careful, competent, decent man who thought about her and sent preserved pears and made himself useful to her dreams without once suggesting that they ought to be smaller dreams. "Isaiah," she said to the east end of the lot. "Pearl," he said, "I think you know how I feel about you." A pause. The kind of pause that is not uncertainty but is the giving of proper weight to something important. "I have hopes in that direction," he said. "I didn't want to assume." She turned to look at him. "Assume?" He looked at her, and the full of what he felt was in his face without any of the usual restraint, and it was considerable, the feeling on that face. It was years of a man who had been careful and thorough and competent and alone, and who had found, unexpectedly, standing at a punch table at the Henson Barn social, the specific person who made his particular kind of heart feel like it had been looking for something it had now found. "Pearl Brooks," he said, with a gravity that made her name feel like a complete sentence. She took the single step between them, and he took it with her. And he put his arms around her, and she put her face against the rough wool of his coat, and they stood in the frozen field in the February morning, with the wind coming quiet off the plain, and stayed there for a long, warm moment that neither of them wanted to end. He kissed her forehead first, very gently, and then she looked up at him and he kissed her properly, the way a man kisses a woman when he means it and intends to keep meaning it, and Pearl felt the last remaining tightness in her chest, the particular tightness she had carried all the way from Missouri, come fully undone. Spring arrived in Millhaven with the specific exuberance of a season that has been kept back too long, the prairie going green almost overnight, the sky enormous and swept clean, the town emerging from its winter inwardness with the blinking, purposeful energy of people who have been waiting for the ground to thaw so they can get on with things. The schoolhouse went up in April. Isaiah had been true to his word about the materials list, bringing it in at nearly a third less than the town carpenter's original estimate, and then had been present most mornings when the building was going up, not running the operation, which was being run by a competent carpenter named Willis Crane, but available and useful, and the source of several suggestions that Willis Crane, who was a practical man without ego about good ideas, adopted without ceremony. Pearl came every day after her morning work at Mabel's to check the progress, and on the afternoons when Isaiah was there, they fell into an easy working partnership, her telling him what she needed and him figuring out whether and how it was achievable, the back and forth of two people who have discovered that their minds work well together, which is one of the more reliable forms of pleasure available to human beings. Mabel Finch watched all of this with a satisfaction so deep that it had become structural. She told Pearl one evening, as they sat in the kitchen behind the store with the oil lamp between them and the April night coming through the open window, that she had never in her 30 years of helping women find their footing in Kansas seen a woman as well suited to this particular man. "You don't know him well enough to say that," Pearl said, though the warmth in her voice said otherwise. "I know enough. He looks at you like the world gets clearer." Mabel picked up her mending. "And you look at him like you finally believe it." Pearl said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The schoolhouse was finished on the 22nd of April, and school began the first Monday of May with 11 children in attendance, the other 3 to follow when their families finished the spring planting. Pearl stood at the front of the room she had imagined all winter, with the morning light coming through the east windows just as she had planned it, and looked at the faces of 11 children who ranged from deeply interested to politely skeptical, and felt something that she recognized as purpose settling into her bones like a thing that intended to stay. Isaiah came to the opening morning, standing in the back of the room with his hat in his hands, while Pearl introduced herself and the rules of the school, and started the older children on their reading lessons and the younger ones on their letters. He did not stay long. He had work to get back to, but he caught her eye when he left, and the look between them carried an entire conversation about what this moment meant and how proud he was and how glad. After school that afternoon, Pearl walked to the edge of town where the prairie proper began, just to feel the wind and decompress, and Isaiah was there, sitting on the fence with his horse tied a few posts down, apparently having decided to come back and wait. "How was it?" he asked. "2 of them can already read better than the primer I started them on. 1 of them hasn't spoken yet but watches everything. 3 are going to be trouble in the best possible way." She stopped beside the fence. It was perfect. He got down from the fence. They were standing in the last afternoon sunlight, the prairie going gold around them, and he looked at her with that expression that was no longer being careful about showing and held out his hand. She took it, and they stood like that, hand in hand, looking out at the enormous Kansas evening. "I need to tell you something," Isaiah said. "Tell me." When I came to Millhaven 2 years ago, I didn't think this was a place where I was going to want to stay. I thought it was a working situation and a decent one, and that was sufficient. I was not looking for anything more than sufficient. He turned to look at her. You have made this place into somewhere I cannot imagine leaving. Pearl looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved her hair and the light was very good, and Isaiah Reed was standing in it with his serious, patient face and his clear eyes, waiting for her to receive what he had said. Isaiah, she said, are you telling me something or are you asking me something? He reached into the pocket of his coat and took out a ring, small and simple, silver, with a turquoise stone set in it that caught the evening light, and held it. I am asking you something, he said. I am asking you if you would be willing to stay here too, not because there isn't anywhere else to go, but because here, with me, is what I'd choose if I could choose anything. Pearl looked at the ring and at the man holding it, and at the prairie behind him going gold and endless in the May evening, and she thought about the long road from Missouri and the stage to Dodge City, and the night at the Henson barn when a quiet man had asked her to step outside and look at the stars, and she thought about what it meant that the stars had been there that night, and that she had said yes, and that every yes since then had led here. Yes, she said. Obviously yes. He put the ring on her finger. It fit almost exactly, a little loose, and he held her hand for a moment in both of his as if settling it in place. Then she put her other hand over his, and they stood in the evening with the ring between their hands and the prairie all around them, and felt the completeness of a thing that had been building toward itself for 8 months finally arrive. They were married in June, in the church that Reverend Hollis had mixed feelings about having his social events in, though he had no mixed feelings about performing a proper wedding in his church, which he approached with the enthusiasm of a man who approves of the institution, even when he has reservations about the individuals. The reservation in this case was not spoken, but present in the form of a certain deliberate correctness in his demeanor, because a black man and a white woman marrying in Kansas in 1879 was not a common occurrence, and not one that every resident of Millhaven regarded with pure warmth. Pearl had known this would be the case, and Isaiah had known it longer and more deeply, and they had discussed it honestly before the proposal, the way two people who respect each other discuss the actual conditions of their lives rather than the idealized version. There will be people who think less of us for it, Isaiah had said. On one of the evenings they had sat on the steps of the schoolhouse after the building was finished but before school started in the blue spring dusk. There will be, Pearl agreed. Are you asking me if that matters? I'm asking you if you've thought about it. I've thought about it. I've thought about the fact that I cannot tell the difference between caring what those people think and giving those people permission to determine my life, and I don't want to give them that permission. Isaiah was quiet for a moment. I've been navigating other people's opinions of me my whole life, he said. I'm not new to it. But I want you to be clear about it before we go further. I'm clear, Pearl said. Are you? I've been clear since February in a frozen field. She had laughed, and the matter was settled, not because the difficulty was dismissed, but because both of them had looked at it directly and decided that what they were building together was worth the difficulty, which is the only honest way a decision like that can be made. The wedding was simple and genuine. Mabel Finch stood up for Pearl as her witness and her person, which made Mabel cry in the specific way she cried, efficiently and without fuss. Jim Delacroix, the ranch owner, stood up for Isaiah with the dignified straightforwardness of a man who thought this was a fine development, and was happy to say so publicly by his presence. The church was about 3/4 full, which was honest, meaning there were those who did not come, but those who did come were the people of Millhaven who were building a real thing and knew it, and their presence filled the room with a quality of goodwill that made the space feel larger than its dimensions. Pearl wore the blue dress again, but Mabel had spent 3 evenings helping her alter and embellish it so that it was transformed into something that was genuinely beautiful while remaining recognizably itself, which Pearl thought was a fair description of how she felt in general these days. Isaiah wore his good clothes, pressed and clean, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle, and his face was doing the thing it did when he felt something very strongly, and was not trying to contain it, open and certain and luminous. Reverend Hollies performed the ceremony with precise propriety and only slightly less warmth than the occasion deserved. But the vows themselves were the vows, and when Pearl said hers, she said them to Isaiah's face and to nobody else in the room. And when Isaiah said his, he said them with the specific gravity of a man who does not make promises lightly and understands that this one is the most important he has ever made. They were married. Isaiah Reed and Pearl Reed, though Pearl kept Brooks for professional purposes, Pearl Brooks Reed, which she wrote at the top of the school register with a feeling of deep satisfaction. The house came next. Isaiah had been living in a foreman's cabin on the Delacroix spread, which was functional but small and set within the working operations of the ranch, in a way that was not suited to a married life with any privacy. Jim Delacroix, who had anticipated this development with some amusement, had already set aside a parcel of land on the western boundary of the spread, where the land was good and flat, and had access to a reliable spring, and had offered it to Isaiah as part of the terms of his continued employment, an arrangement that was good for both parties and that Isaiah had negotiated carefully and got in writing. They built their own house that summer, a real house, not grand but solid, 2 rooms and a kitchen with space for more rooms to be added. Isaiah did much of the building himself, with help from 2 ranch hands named Domingo and Cal, who were glad to have the additional work, and Pearl contributed in all the ways that were her particular skills, organizing the materials and the schedule, and managing the various small crises that arise during construction with a calm practicality that Domingo, who had built 3 houses in his life, told Isaiah was a rare quality in a building partner. Pearl and Isaiah slept in the main room of Mabel's store for 6 weeks while the house went up, which Mabel declared loudly to be no imposition, and which Pearl suspected was not entirely true, but Mabel's generosity was too deep and too real to be argued with. They moved into the house on a hot August evening, with the prairie grasses standing tall and the last light of the day coming through the new windows, and landing on the wooden floor that Isaiah had laid himself, board by board. And Pearl stood in the center of the main room and turned in a slow circle and felt the walls around her as hers, genuinely hers and his, built with their hands and their intention. "Well," said Isaiah from the doorway. "Well," said Pearl. He crossed the room and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against him, and they looked out the east window at the darkening prairie where the first stars were just beginning to appear. "Same stars," he said, against her hair. "Different view," she said. The first year of their marriage was the most complete year Pearl had ever lived. Not the easiest, there were difficulties. The particular frictions that come from 2 self-sufficient people learning to share a life and a space, and the daily decisions that a household requires. Isaiah had a methodical and early morning quality to his days that occasionally conflicted with Pearl's tendency to work late and start late, and they had to negotiate these rhythms with the practical humor of 2 people who found each other endearing even when they found each other inconvenient. The school continued to grow. By the fall of 1879, Pearl had 17 students, and by the following spring she had 22, which was the number that made Mayor Holbrook, after Pearl's pointed and well-prepared visit to his office, finally agree to the full wage she had been promised. She spent it on more books. Isaiah's professional reputation, already strong, grew through the winter and into the new year as the Delacroix operation expanded its breeding program, and Isaiah's management of the ranch's operations became the acknowledged reason for its financial stability in a year when several other operations in the county were struggling. Jim Delacroix was not a demonstrative man, But he gave Isaiah a significant raise in the spring and told him plainly that he was the best foreman he had ever employed, which Isaiah received with equanimity and later told Pearl with a quiet pride he allowed himself privately. There was a night in November, about a year after the wedding, when a situation arose that was one of the harder things they faced together. A man named Drummond, who owned a spread to the north and who had made his views about Isaiah's position and marriage known through a series of pointed absences from social occasions and a couple of comments overheard at the feed store, got drunk at the Millhaven saloon, and said some ugly things in a public way that were specifically about Isaiah and Pearl. Tom Garrett, who had brought Isaiah to the barn social in the first place, and who had come to regard Isaiah as a friend and Pearl as someone he was proud to know, intervened verbally and firmly, and Willis Crane, the carpenter, backed him up, and Drummond was removed from the saloon by its owner before anything physical occurred. Isaiah heard about it the next day, from 3 different people who each told him with the specific quality of discomfort that people have when they are reporting something they are ashamed of on someone else's behalf. He was quiet about it in a way Pearl recognized as the serious stillness, and that evening she sat beside him at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and waited. "I'm not surprised," he said finally. "Drummond has been that man since before we married. I knew he was that man. Knowing and having it happen publicly are different things." "Yes." Pearl put her hand on the table and he put his on top of it. "What do you want to do about it?" she asked. "Nothing and everything," he said. "I want to be the foreman of the best-run spread in Caldwell County and have the school my wife built be the school every parent in the county wants their children in. And I want to be the man in this town whose word means something. And I want Drummond's opinion to be as irrelevant as it deserves to be because of those other things. That's what I want to do about it." Pearl looked at him. "That is a very good plan," she said. "It takes time. We have time." He squeezed her hand and they sat together in the kitchen of the house they had built with the November wind moving around it, and Pearl thought about the long shape of a life and how the things you build slowly and carefully outlast the things that try to reduce them. The spring of 1880 brought a particular joy. Pearl had suspected it through February's cold, had been quietly certain by March, and told Isaiah on an April evening when they were sitting on the front step of their house, watching the last light go out of the sky. She simply took his hand and placed it flat on her stomach and looked at him. He looked at his hand and then at her face, and something happened in his expression that she had never quite seen before, something that was beyond even his deepest steadiness, something younger and more naked, a joy so complete it had a quality of surprise to it. "Pearl," he said, and it was barely a sound. "September," she said, "maybe October." He pulled her close and held her with his face against her hair, and she felt him breathe deeply and slowly, as if steadying himself against the enormity of the happiness. And Pearl held on to him and thought that this moment, this April evening on their own step with the stars coming out over their own land, was something she would carry in the deepest part of her for the rest of her life. The pregnancy was good, mostly. Pearl continued teaching through June, which prompted one earnest and largely well-meaning conversation with Mayor Holbrook about propriety that Pearl navigated with a combination of logic and firmness that left the mayor agreeing that there was no particular reason a visibly pregnant woman should not educate children, particularly when she was the only teacher the school had. She stopped teaching in late July, partly at Isaiah's request and partly because the summer heat and the weight of the baby had begun to make standing in a classroom for 6 hours a day genuinely difficult. The baby came in September as predicted, on a morning that started with a clear sky and shifted by noon to the particular clouds that preceded a weather change. And by the time Pearl's labor was well established, the sky outside the bedroom windows was dark gold and strange. And Isaiah, who had ridden to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Cecilia Marsh who had been delivering babies in the county for 15 years, made it back in time but barely. arriving mud-spattered and wide-eyed, and was told firmly by Cecilia to go sit in the kitchen. Isaiah sat in the kitchen for 4 hours and did not, Pearl later learned, sit still for any of them. He paced and he prayed and he listened to everything, and at some point Cecilia's apprentice, a girl named Hattie, came out and told him it was going well and was not worried and he should drink some water, and he drank the water and paced some more. When Cecilia opened the bedroom door and told him he could come in, he crossed the house in 4 steps and found Pearl in the bed, tired and bright-eyed and alive, with a bundle in her arms that was making a small, insistent sound that was somehow the best sound Isaiah had ever heard in his life. "A boy," Pearl said. "Come see." He sat on the edge of the bed, and Pearl put the baby into his arms, and Isaiah Reed held his son for the first time and looked at this small, red-faced person who was his and Pearl's and the world's all at once, and his face was entirely undone, fully open, every guard down, and Pearl watched him and felt such an enormous love for this man that it pressed against the inside of her chest. "Henry," Isaiah said, trying the name they had chosen. "Henry Isaiah Reed," Pearl confirmed. Henry opened his eyes at the sound of his name, or at least appeared to, though Cecilia, who was being practical in the corner, said newborns don't really focus at that stage. Isaiah and Pearl did not care about this information. They named him Henry after Isaiah's grandfather on his mother's side, a man Pearl would never meet, but whose influence was present in the way Isaiah moved through the world, in his patience and his gravity and the particular seriousness with which he took the matter of being a person of integrity. Henry was a loud and determined baby who communicated his needs with a precision that suggested he had arrived in the world with opinions already formed. Pearl fed him and Isaiah rocked him, and both of them suffered through the particular exhaustion of early parenthood, with the wry solidarity of 2 people who are in something together and know it. Mabel came out to see the baby on the 3rd day, and held him with the competence of a woman who had helped raise 6 younger siblings and declared him a fine specimen, and cried, in her efficient way, while doing so. Jim Delacroix sent a bottle of good whiskey and a cured ham, which were exactly the right things to send. The school sent a card signed by all 17 students who were currently enrolled, in 17 different versions of handwriting, which Pearl propped on the windowsill and did not move for 6 months. Isaiah went back to work when Henry was 2 weeks old, and Pearl managed the days with the baby with the same methodical intelligence she brought to everything, establishing rhythms and systems and figuring out, through trial and stubborn persistence, the particular things that Henry needed and the particular things that soothed him. She also began writing a curriculum for the school's coming year during the nap times, pages and pages of careful lesson plans in her clear, compact handwriting, because Pearl Brooksreed was not a woman who could leave her mind idle for very long. By November, Henry was sleeping in longer stretches, and Pearl had resumed the school's planning and begun the conversations about taking on a second teacher for the following year, since enrollment was now approaching a number that exceeded what one person could reasonably manage. Isaiah, in the evenings after Henry was down, would sometimes read over the curriculum she was developing and offer observations from the perspective of a man who had seen what education meant and did not mean in the practical world. And these conversations were among the ones Pearl valued most, because Isaiah thought about education the way he thought about everything, with a combination of principle and pragmatism that balanced her own more purely idealistic tendencies. The second Christmas in their house was the kind of Christmas that becomes the standard by which all subsequent Christmases are measured. Henry was 3 months old and too young to understand it, but young enough to be delighted by the candlelight and the paper ornaments Pearl had made, and Isaiah had cut a small cedar from the ridge and set it up in the main room, and it smelled of resin and cold air, and the house was warm and full of the particular domestic grace that Pearl had not known she was capable of creating until she created it. They sat by the fire after Henry was asleep, Pearl with her feet tucked up and a cup of tea, and Isaiah with the accounting books from the ranch that he occasionally worked on in the evenings. And the fire crackled, and the cedar smelled good, and outside the Kansas winter was doing what it did, and inside everything was warm and complete. "Are you happy?" Pearl asked, because she wanted to hear it, not because she doubted it. Isaiah put the accounting book down and looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment with the full attention he gave to things that mattered, and she let him look. "You know that story I told you about my grandmother teaching me to find north?" he said. "Yes. She told me that the reason the star was called the North Star was because it was the constant one. Everything else in the sky rotates around it. The whole sky moves, and that one thing stays fixed." He paused. "I think about that now. I think about how my whole life has been moving and changing and working and building, and I have found the fixed thing." Pearl looked at him over her teacup, and the firelight was on his face, and she felt the full weight of what they had made together. The house, the school, the child sleeping in the next room, the ring on her finger, the 8 years stretching back to a barn with paper lanterns and a fiddle player who only knew 4 songs. "That is possibly the most romantic thing you have ever said to me," she said, "and you are normally not a man who says romantic things." "I have my moments." She moved across the room and sat beside him on the bench and leaned her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat by the fire and listened to the winter outside doing what winter does, and inside there was only warmth. The years that followed were not without their hardships, because no life in the Kansas Territory in the 1880s was without hardship, the weather being what it was, and the land being what it was, and the particular challenges of building a life in a place that was still in the middle of deciding what it was going to be. There were dry seasons and difficult cattle prices, and the ongoing work of maintaining Isaiah's professional position in a world that still found ways, large and small, to make the position harder for him than it would have been for a man who looked different. Pearl fought her own battles too, the quiet everyday battles of a woman who was taken more or less seriously by the civic structures around her depending on the day and the man in question, and who had learned to be strategic about which fights to take on and which to root around. But the hardships were the context. The story was something else. The story was Henry learning to walk in the spring of 1881, doing it by holding on to the door frames and the table legs and occasionally Isaiah's finger, and then one afternoon simply walking across the kitchen floor to Pearl with the expression of a person who has just discovered a previously unknown fact about himself. The story was the school, which by 1882 had 2 teachers and 34 students, and a second room added to the original building, and a reputation in the county as a serious institution, several families having relocated to Millhaven at least partly because of it. Pearl taught the older students herself, and hired a young woman named Frances Adler for the younger grades, and the 2 of them ran it together with a complementary authority that made it work. The story was Isaiah standing in Millhaven, which had grown as he had planned it would, through the quality of his work and the seriousness of his character, until he was simply one of the men in the county whose opinion was sought and whose word was trusted. And while Drummond and his kind did not disappear, they became what Isaiah had intended them to become, irrelevant in the face of what he had built. The story was the night in the fall of 1882 when Pearl told Isaiah she was expecting again, this time in the summer, and his response was a slow, deep smile and the words, "Good," which he said with such completeness that no additional words were necessary. The second baby, born in July of 1883, was a girl. They named her Clara for both their mothers, and she arrived in the same bedroom where Henry had arrived, attended by Cecilia Marsh again, with Isaiah in the kitchen again, though this time he managed to sit still for longer stretches. Clara had Pearl's dark eyes and Isaiah's steady temperament, and a quality of alert observation that suggested she was taking inventory of everything around her from the very first weeks. Henry, who was 2.5 by the time Clara arrived, approached his new sister with a seriousness that made both Isaiah and Pearl laugh into their hands. He examined her, determined she was acceptable, and thereafter stood guard over her cradle with the proprietary concern of a person who has decided that something is now their responsibility. The years gathered and deepened. The house gained more rooms. The school gained more students and eventually a second building. Isaiah's professional authority grew and broadened. Millhaven itself grew, new families arriving with the expansion of the railroad, new businesses opening, the social fabric of the town becoming more complex and more layered. And in that growing complexity, there was more room for people to be who they were. And the things that had been unusual about Pearl and Isaiah became simply the things that were true about them. There was an evening in the spring of 1884, Henry 4 years old and Clara almost a year, when Pearl walked out to where Isaiah was working on the east fence of their property with the late sun behind her and a shawl around her shoulders and Henry trotting beside her holding her hand. And Isaiah looked up from the fence post and saw his wife and his son coming across the greening field toward him in the last warm light. And he straightened up and just looked, not moving toward them yet. Just looking, because the sight of it needed to be looked at before anything else. Pearl saw him looking and understood and walked toward him at the same pace, unhurried, and they met in the middle of the field and Henry ran the last few yards to his father's legs and was scooped up and Isaiah held him and looked at Pearl and the evening was all around them. "How's the fence?" Pearl asked. "Solid," he said. "Good." She tucked her hand into the crook of his arm that wasn't holding Henry, and they walked back toward the house together in the warm last light. And the prairie moved around them with its grass and its wind, and the sky above was the enormous Kansas sky, just beginning to show the first faint scatter of early stars in the east. Pearl looked up, as she always did when the first stars appeared, old habit from the evening of the Henson barn and the big quiet sky and the tall man who had simply asked her to come look. She still felt it, that original feeling, standing under the stars, the largeness of the world and the smallness and the particular comfort of standing next to the right person while you feel both. "Orion," Henry said suddenly, pointing east, though it was too early and too light for Orion, the boy having recently been taught his first constellation and finding it everywhere. "Not yet," Isaiah told him, "but soon. When it gets darker, it's always there. You just have to wait for it." Henry considered this with the seriousness of a child who takes information literally and finds it usually worth applying. "Okay," he said. They went inside, and the lamp was lit, and Clara was awake in her cradle making small contented sounds, and Pearl lifted her and held her warm weight while Isaiah set Henry down and lit the kitchen stove, and the house was alive with the ordinary grace of a family in the evening of an ordinary day. There was nothing ordinary about it, and both of them knew it, and neither of them needed to say so. 6 years after the night at the Henson barn, Pearl sometimes thought about the woman who had stood in the doorway in the blue dress, and heard the fiddle, and felt the particular aloneness of someone who has traveled far to escape one life, and has not yet found the next one. She thought about her with tenderness rather than distance, because that woman had been brave and she had been right to come west, and she had been exactly where she needed to be on that September evening, when a quiet man had set his punch cup down and asked her if she'd like to step outside. She had stepped outside. She had never come back in, not to the cautious and diminished version of herself that Missouri had made, not to the careful contracted life she had been building toward. She had come out under the stars and found her North Star and stayed. In the summer of 1885, Pearl received a letter from her mother in Missouri saying that her mother's health was declining and asking if Pearl might consider a visit. Pearl brought the letter to Isaiah over the supper table, and he read it and looked at her. "We'll go," he said. Pearl looked at him. "Isaiah, the drive season. Jim Delacroix has a second foreman now. I've trained him well. He can manage 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Your mother hasn't met the children." Pearl felt the familiar warmth that came with the way this man understood what mattered before she had to articulate it. "She hasn't," she said. "She should." They went in August, the four of them, on the train from Wichita east into Missouri, and Henry pressed his face to the train window the entire journey with the intensity of a child for whom the world is still primarily an object of wonder. And Clara slept in Pearl's arms with her usual serene indifference to circumstance. And Isaiah sat beside Pearl with his arm along the back of the seat, and watched the land change from the flat plains he knew into the rolling Missouri hills, with the alert interest of a man who finds new landscapes genuinely interesting. Pearl's mother was smaller than Pearl remembered, and more fragile, but her eyes were sharp, and she sat up straight in her chair to receive them. She looked at Isaiah with the frank assessment of a woman who has lived long enough to know that what matters is character, and who reads character quickly. She looked at Henry and Clara with the specific emotional response of a grandmother encountering grandchildren she thought she might never meet. And she looked at Pearl with the look of a mother who sees that her daughter is genuinely, deeply well. The visit lasted 3 weeks in the end because Pearl's mother's health stabilized once they were there, improved even, and she would not hear of them leaving sooner. Isaiah learned to play chess from Pearl's brother Thomas, who had expected, Pearl could tell, to find reason for wariness and found instead a man who was thoughtful and direct, and who clearly loved his sister in the specific way of a man who has built something real with a person and knows its value. Thomas came to Pearl one evening while Isaiah was sitting on the porch with their mother, and said, with the awkward honesty of a man not accustomed to saying gracious things, that he was glad she had found him. "So am I," Pearl said. They returned to Millhaven in September, and the prairie welcomed them back with its enormous indifference, the same as ever, the sky wide and the grass moving, and the town sitting on the flat land as if it had always been there and always would be. Henry ran from the station platform with his arms out like a bird and yelled something about being home, and Clara, walking steadily now, tottered after him in the serious manner she had developed for serious business. Pearl stood on the platform with Isaiah beside her and looked at the town she had come to on a stage from Dodge City 6 years ago with one trunk and a letter of introduction, and she felt the full depth of what Millhaven now was, which was not just a place, but the specific geography of her life. The streets where she walked with her husband and the schoolhouse she had built and the house on the edge of the Delacroix spread with the east window that let in the morning light and the front step where she and Isaiah sat in the evenings. "Home," Isaiah said beside her. "Home," Pearl agreed. She took his hand and they walked off the platform into the afternoon, their children running ahead, and behind them the train pulled away on the rails that had once threatened to take the Delacroix land and now simply served as roads did, carrying people toward their lives. The schoolhouse continued. It would eventually, in another decade, become the foundation of the county's formal school district, with Pearl's curriculum as its model and Pearl's reputation as its credential. She would teach for another 20 years after that first September morning in 1879. Different children, but always the same commitment. And Millhaven children would grow up and go to Wichita and Topeka and further, and carry in themselves the shape of thinking that Pearl had taught them, which was the shape of taking the world seriously and asking real questions about it. Isaiah would manage the Delacroix spread until Jim Delacroix retired and his son Thomas took over, and Thomas Delacroix, who had grown up watching Isaiah work, made the arrangement permanent and gave Isaiah a share of the operation as well as a wage, because the spread's success was inseparable from the man who had run it, and Thomas Delacroix was honest enough to acknowledge that in writing. Henry grew up to have his father's build, and his mother's clarity of mind, and his grandmother's ability to navigate by stars, which Isaiah taught him properly one summer when the boy was 8. Both of them lying on their backs in the prairie grass behind the house with the full sky overhead. Isaiah pointing and naming, and Henry absorbing with the specific intensity he brought to things he had decided to know completely. Clara grew up with Pearl's dark eyes and her mother's absolute unwillingness to be diminished, and she became the kind of woman who walked into rooms and made them larger by being in them, which was something both her parents recognized and were proud of without entirely taking credit for. There was a night in the autumn of 1886, a Saturday evening in October, when the new social hall that Millhaven had built the previous year was full of lamplight and fiddle music, a real band now with 3 instruments, and Pearl and Isaiah were there with Henry and Clara. Henry had fallen asleep on a bench in the corner with the philosophical completeness of a child who is done for the day, and Clara was being carried by Mabel Finch, who was older now and moved more carefully but whose arms were still good, and who looked at the baby girl in her arms with the expression of a woman whose investments in other people's happiness have paid out beyond any reasonable expectation. Isaiah asked Pearl to dance. This was not a thing he had done before on account of his well-documented position on the matter. "You cannot dance," Pearl reminded him with a smile that was already saying yes. "I've been practicing," he said. She looked at him. "With whom?" "Henry." "He doesn't judge. Henry is 4. He's a good teacher, low expectations." She laughed, the real laugh, the one that was too loud for some occasions and exactly right for this one, and she took his hand and let him lead her to the floor. He was not good, exactly, but he was not as bad as he had claimed at the Henson barn 7 years ago, and there was something about the fact of his having practiced, of having decided that this was something worth doing because it was something she enjoyed, that made being led through the steps by him the best dancing Pearl had ever done. They moved around the floor of the Millhaven social hall with the fiddle and 2 other instruments playing something bright and celebratory, and Pearl looked at Isaiah's face, focused and a little determined and also quietly delighted with himself, and she felt the whole arc of the thing, from the September barn to here, from the stars over the Henson farm to the October night outside these windows. From the woman in the doorway with one trunk to this woman in this man's arms in a room full of people who were their community and their history. When the dance ended, Isaiah was breathing slightly harder than usual and Pearl was laughing still, and he bent down and said quietly near her ear, "I'll improve." "You were perfect," she said, and meant it. They went outside afterward because the hall was warm, the way halls always get warm when enough people are in them, and they stood in the October night with the stars overhead, clear and cold and enormous, the same stars they had stood under on the September night 7 years ago when everything had begun. Pearl looked up. Isaiah looked up with her. They stood shoulder to shoulder with the prairie dark around them, and the music coming muffled through the walls and their children inside in good hands and their life solid and real around them. And Pearl thought about the woman she had been on the night she first looked up at these stars with this man. And she thought about all the territory between then and now, all the built things and the hard things and the growing things, and she felt it as one whole, coherent and complete, a life that had found its shape. "Same stars," she said. "Same stars," he agreed. "Better view." She put her hand in his and they stood in the autumn night under the endless Kansas sky, and the stars were as they had always been, fixed in their places, the hunter and the river and the North Star that does not move, and Pearl Brooksreed was exactly where she had chosen to be, exactly where she had arrived on the night she stepped outside and looked up and found the fixed thing. Inside, the music played on. Outside, the stars burned clear, and Pearl never needed to go back in.